And I think my job in that process was just being uh, a cheerleader for the work that you did and for the CRLC. And so I'm happy to know you, and I'm happy to see that your work continues in other ways. And I got to know some of your work through that. Um, and so I know that I think that this week the book says talking a little bit about safer spaces, and so I kind of want to talk a little bit about that. And so um, I was before I was elected vice president of the ELCA. I was the vice president of the Southeastern Synod, and the Southeastern Synod, for those of you who don't know, are the states of Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. My predecessor at vice president in Southeastern Synod was a woman named Doris Underwood, who was a black woman. But one of the things that was very interesting is if you know that location, there are a number of black Lutheran churches, but yet all of our bishops have been white. I think all of our other officers have been white. It was just the vice president that was a person of color. And then I got elected as the first Asian American vice president in the LCA, and I wanted to look to see if there had been other officers that were Asian, and there weren't. And one of the things that was interesting is aside from vice president, right? And if you know the history of the LCA vice presidents, ever since '97, when Dr. Addie Butler was elected vice president of the LCA, it has been a person of color. So after Addie Butler, it was Carlos Pena, and then it was Bill Horn, and then it was myself. And aside from that, only Pastor Linda Norman, who was treasurer for 6 years, everyone else has been white. And so I joked in some safe spaces that, we store our people of color in the vice president spot, right? The vice president spot doesn't really have a lot of power, right? The vice president chairs the church council. Um, and there's whatever power, there may be some bully pulpit power, but really the folks that run the day-to-day stuff are the presiding bishop and the presiding and some of those executives, and then also the secretary has some role, and even in the treasurer is more of a directed person, right? um, and so it was always kind of a joke about that, about, hey, it seems interesting, right? It's people of color all in, like, for almost 30 years in the vice president role, and yet we don't really do that with other spots, right? And so I was there a few, well, I don't know, what was that, a few weeks ago? It feels like forever, and it feels like yesterday, the churchwide assembly, if you know what I mean, if people were there. And so I remember sitting there and I'm thinking, so, the third ballot happened, and I was like, knowing, following these things, knowing the trends, I was like, holy crap, we're going to elect a black bishop. and, and I was, I was like, um, I was like, oh wow, like and so that happened, and then afterwards, I was like, okay, going off what Pastor Carlos said, I was like, okay, secretary's coming up, like it's going to be like, oh, we already did our black person, right? Now we're going to go and just do like a regular white person. And saying that, like, Bishop Regal and I are super close, right? And so, like, I love Bishop Regal quite a bit, but I was kind of like sitting there at the last, was at the fourth and the fifth ballots, and I was like, okay, they're gonna vote for Regal. Like, obviously, they're gonna do this because they're not gonna put two black people on these two roles. Like, that's just not gonna happen. Like, and I was all prepared for it, right? And I just knew it because it was like that whole thing where you're just like, oh, of course, this is gonna happen. Let me steal that in my heart, so I don't get excited or something about it. And so, you know, and then Cece won, and I was like, and she won by, and it was close, but I think on the bout before she was a little bit behind, and Pastor Mills won, and I knew Pastor Mills only briefly. I mean, I've talked to her on very sporadic occasions. I knew of her, of course. I knew that she was up in the mix and really close for North Carolina Synod Bishop. And, I sent a few messages saying, keep your head high. You did a fantastic job. And I did not know at the time that, basically that whole experience was preparing her. That was not her position. That was not her role, right? If she had won that position, for North Carolina bishop, she might have pulled her name out when it came to secretary, right? And so, like there was something going on there. The spirit was moving there, right? And it was, one of those things where it's like, wow. And I put on Facebook a few weeks ago that it really hit me hard. Like I kind of felt this really sort of release, inside that I didn't know I was holding up. And now I look back and I realize, oh yeah, we were gonna, I just didn't think that this was gonna happen at all. And I'm saying that nothing against, like, say, Bishop Regal or something like that, but it was just one of those things where I was like, well, of course, they're gonna do the balance thing, right? And so the fact that now we have a presiding bishop elect who's African descent, and we have a secretary elect that's African descent, and we have a vice president that's Asian descent. Um, it's kind of, I was joking around with Treasurer Fedek. I'm like, well, you're the only white person around, and she's, you know, and she laughed at it, but I was like, what a switch, what a switch. I mean, just incredible. And so, one of the things that's interesting to me is, and I wonder about that. I'm like, some of the stuff we were saying in safe spaces, like, it's like, can we be more open about it? Or, it's kind of like a little hesitancy still, right? And we don't know where we're going yet. I think as Pastor Carla said, like we have that implicit, like, can we really loosen? Can we really lower the guard? Can we really do this? One of the things that's interesting is still in our church. Like, I read things where people were like saying things that were inappropriate, right? And were done solely on race. And I have a story that, as vice president, I go to synod assemblies, right? And I go to synods to do things. And I went up to a synod assembly and I was doing the church-wide presentation. And afterwards, white man came up to me and he shook my hand and he said, I'm happy to see you here. And this was 2 years after I'd been elected. And he goes, I saw your name. I thought you were a Muslim. And then you got up on the stage and I realized that you love Jesus. And I said, I'm the vice president of the ELCA. And I mean, did you think, I mean, I realize what my name is, but did you think that the ELCA elected a Muslim to one of its officer roles? I mean, like, we talk about, I think, microaggressions or macro or all aggression sort of thing, right? And it was one of those things that really struck me as even though I had been an officer of the church, right? It was still one of those things where people are like, well, I thought you weren't truly one of us, right? I mean, that's kind of what it was said. And so there is that hesitancy in myself as well. It's like, what's going to happen? What's going to blow back? What's going to be the "you're not one of us" sort of response? For all the celebration, and I celebrate it enough, but both of these um, shockingly wonderful, experienced, wise people came through the team program. And if something happens, is that going to be used against them? Right. And so it's one of those. So I have this experience and this feeling of, what ways can we lift up these leaders before they get there? And in terms of talking about, you know, what do we need in this church, and how can we actually support these things that we want to happen? I think we want more people to come up through team or things of that nature, right? I think it's a fantastic opportunity. I think it's an amazing thing to see folks. You don't have to go through the whole step, the whole college to seminary step. Um, I have and seen, and second career pastors is massive, and people that get really hit hard. I've noticed in my own time, a lot of friends of mine are women of color, and they go through candidacy processes as second career, and they get completely crapped on. Thank one of my good friends. She got a call, but she was going through candidacy, and she was incredibly wonderful business and just had this fantastic mind. And the candidacy committee said, "Well, that's too much of a distraction." Um, you know, and someone on the candidacy committee suggested to them, "Why don't you quit your job?" And my friend goes, "Well, how am I supposed to provide for my family?" And this person says, "Well, you can take out loans." And 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 I am certain I've never heard, and maybe it exists, but I've never heard someone speaking to a white person in that way. Um, you know, or a man, right? Because she's a woman, right? So maybe the thought was, well, you should let your husband provide, sort of thing, right? Um, like there are these mentalities that are in place that still kind of create these systems and these kind of issues where people are trying to do this wonderful work and they keep stepping in things that are traps that people have created for them. Um, and so I've seen this around the church, and it's one of those things that bothers me, and one of those things that I try to figure out, how do we get around? How do we support our leaders by preventing these things? How do we get these things out in the open, right? Because there's a lot of stuff of, oh, I don't actually believe that happened, right? And it's like, no, no, it happened, and it is happening. And so in on all the light of in all the light of the joy, right? And that spoke to me. That's why I'm kind of going on these tangents about all the joy. What Pastor Carl was talking about, the kind of retrenchment as well, right? And so I have seen just wonderful things in this church as being vice president in both contexts. Um, but I also see how we just completely stonewall something out of the norm, and how I mean the safer spaces that exist in are life giving. I mean, and I understand it too. I mean, it's a weird thing, right? Like not all people of color are the same, but when people of color get together, sometimes, right, we can all like I'm Asian. I hang out with Carla, and I'm like, all right, I can talk to you honestly, and I don't have to worry, that something's gonna come up, right? I don't have to worry if I lament that you're gonna go back to whoever I'm complaining about and say blah blah blah. That happened to me recently too. Um, you know, I can't believe this person told you about this, but said this about you, right? Sort of thing. Um, like there's a level of safety among people of color that sometimes doesn't really exist with a lot of well-meaning white liberal folks, and so there's a different face I put upon it, and it's not to be cruel to those of you who are white on the call. um, it's self-protective a lot of times because things go around and kind of things kind of spiral out sometimes, especially when you're a person of color. People don't want to believe you on what you're talking about, um, and so um, I think one of the things that we need to do, especially for our presiding bishop elect and our secretary elect, is to continually work to help spin their words in the best possible way, because people are going to try to spin them in a very negative way when they can get away with it. Um, and so I'm kind of dedicated to doing some of that work. And I have I mean, I'm considered a very optimistic person. I think that Bishop Curry and Pastor Secretary Elect Mills are going to be fantastic role models, and young people of color are going to see they can be on top of this church. As long as it survives but as long as they can be on the top levels of this church. And I think that our role and our kind of looking forward, our role is to help birth that youth, that people of color youth into being. Because I think at when we get together in some of these events, you'll see, they'll say, what was that at the church assembly, 16% youth or something like that, right? And there are probably a little more people of color than you would think that in a Lutheran function. Like we can help birth that, to make things more comfortable. Um, and I'd like to see that too. I mean, just to be in the spots where I'm more comfortable about these things. And so um, that was a much of a story, but it was much of more feelings than story. But that's kind of where I'm at this point.
Thank you. Because I know that, yes, to everything you said, and the naming of safe spaces and or safer spaces, and that there is an automatic differentiation. And I know some folks have refer to it as code switching, which is often a more corporate term, but there is a difference in the way that I automatically speak when I know that I am in a room with people of color, and I much more am ready to assume that there will be grace for me to slip into colloquial expression or accents, or to name something that isn't perfect or positive and not be told I'm being negative, or that I'm trying to drag things down, or that I clearly must just not understand it. And I
Mm.
also have absolutely had, the people that the man that put his hands on my cheeks and said, you know what, that was actually a good sermon. You're the first woman pastor I didn't hate. And as if I should really be honored that this man who felt it was absolutely okay to be patting me on my cheeks like this, as if I was both a child and a possession. Um, and so the affirmation of just knowing, like, yes, it is true that we have been so trained because of real experiences to not assume grace, even in Lutheran spaces, to not assume um, the that good intentions will be assumed, that Luther's commandments of how we are to speak about individuals, that how we are to interpret our words, um, that will carry over to Lutherans of color, because too many people still assume that we are not real Lutherans. And I have also had those experiences, the assumption that, well, you clearly became Lutheran late in life. Were you raised Baptist or Kojic? I was raised Episcopalian. But the assumption is there that, I'm not a real Lutheran, and that I struggle with Lutheran theology, which is actually exactly why I fell in love with the denomination. And so I really appreciate you just naming, here's what we can be aware of, because it's real. So this time we're going to send you into some breakout rooms for a short period of time, for about 15 minutes. Um, and so, Michael, will you share some potential starter questions that can help individuals perhaps lean more into some of the things that Vice President Imran uh, helped us lift up and be more aware of, because they very much do relate to the chapters, and perhaps do some group brainstorming before we continue this individual
Yeah.
journeying.
Yeah. Thank you, Vice President, and thank you, Pastor Carla. When we get into the small groups, introduce yourselves to one another briefly, and maybe prepare to jot down a few notes of your comments so that when we get back to the large group, you can put those into the chat box and you can share some of your feedback with the whole group, and we can record some of that. I put a link in the chat box right now for some prompts for your conversations. I was trying to take notes as Vice President Siddiqui was speaking about some of the experiences that you have and the requests that you're making to the rest of us. I tried to capture those as much as possible. So think about those. How can we support Presiding Bishop-elect Yehiel Curry and Secretary-elect Reverend C.C. Mills? How can we support the team process, women of color who are becoming leaders? How can we help give birth to the young people of color coming to be leaders in this church? Then, if you have time, in the document are a couple of questions that could relate specifically to the two chapters in the book. Take a look at those if you have time. And then we'll call you back at the end of the about 15 minutes in the conversation. Back to you.
Thank you. And just as a friendly reminder, most of the people on this call are white allies, which we celebrate. If you do happen to have voices of color in the space, please remember that those voices can be uplifted or centered. That's a very practical way that we can practice our allyship in the space, is making sure that there is room for people of color with lived experience to speak. So thank you for remembering and modeling that. And we will see you in just a few minutes.
Welcome back, everyone. Or welcome forward, I like to say. I learned that once, is that we're heading forward. And from your conversations, in the chat box, share some of the responses that you had to Vice President Siddiqui's experiences, his requests of us, as we look forward to this new era of leadership in the ELCA. And and let's see. Also, I want to help you think about taking some of the next steps also that Pastor Denson Byers recommends in her book. In chapters 2 and 3, she encourages congregations to do our own work in terms of doing racial equity audits, uh, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility audits, to think about how we're structuring ourselves, our bodies, our institutions, and our buildings. Review and revise personnel policies and practices. Make talk about race and racism a regular thing that you do. Talk openly about it in your communities. Unpack white privilege. She recommends a couple of different books. One of them is Uprooting Racism: How White People Can Work for Racial Justice. And that's by a white man named Paul Keivel, by the way. And Pastor Carla and I were noticing I'm one of the only male identified people on this call. We men have a lot of work to do, and I'm looking for other men. David Scher is looking for other men to be in relationship with on this journey. So if you have any people that you want to put me in touch with and in relationship with, please do so. Thanks to those of you that are putting some of your responses in the chat box to Vice President Siddiqui's questions and experiences. And yeah, take a look at those suggestions that other people are saying and raising up.
Right. I appreciate how many people are mentioning that yes, the secretary is paid, the treasurer is paid, the vice president is the only unpaid position. The vice president of the entire ELCA is indeed an uncompensated volunteer position. And so do we think that it's a coincidence that that is the position most frequently filled by people of color? Uh, I will leave that up to you to determine. And I really appreciate how many folks are lifting up the importance of learning more about the team program, that if we're going to have folks pushing back against that, or using that to undermine the validity of Secretary Mills and presiding Bishop Curry, that just learning about the team program can be something that can be helpful. Like, actually, did you know that this is the kind of education they go through, and this is the work that they um, that they are a part of? And I appreciate the lifting up of Mile and Mila, and recognizing that they're are some really beautiful efforts of creating safer spaces where people of color, people of different abilities, can actually gather. And so learning, well, uh, where are those spaces that we can, for leaders of color, be like, hey, are you aware that these are happening, and that if we don't have in our synod or our congregation people of color or safer spaces, we there are some that exist, and we can certainly get you contact information or connections if that would be helpful, because I know I have had that happen with me, that folks have reached out, and as someone working in the Senate office, I'm like, actually, well, we do have ELCA coaching, and we can use some funds to help connect you with a coach who comes from a similar ethnic background or ability or gender or sexual orientation. We have connected folks with mentors that were out of synod, um, that, kind of, what does the welcome wagon look like if there's not necessarily people that may encourage a sense of safety, and that just helping people make those connections can be really helpful.
Yeah.
Oh, there's some just awesome things. And I encourage you, you can click on those little three dots at the top right hand of the chat box, and save the chat if there are suggestions that you want to keep reading through.
Mhm. Yeah, if I
Lots
could
of
make,
really beautiful points for advocacy.
yeah, a comment about the team ministry. TEAM stands for Theological Education for Emerging Ministries, and it started in the 1980s, excuse me, 1990s, primarily as a way for congregations that were predominantly led by African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans to raise up leaders from among their congregations. Um, but then very quickly, the majority of people who were in the team process were white rural leaders. It's very interesting that it may be still that the majority of team ministers are actually coming from white rural congregations. And so I want us to think about how we're categorizing team, and some of the, I think, discrimination that comes from to team ministers is because of our racism in the church, and that we're ignorant of what's actually the history of that ministry and the reason that it exists. So just let's learn more about that and its history and all the beautiful gifts that have been shared. Um, but let's go for that.
I love it. So thank you for the incredible participation. And before we do have a final prayer and blessing to send us out into our reading and our work for the next week and beyond, I want to put in the chat two links there. White Lutherans for Racial Justice. If you are not a member, you can be. And Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries. If you are not aware of the organization, you also can be. And I know that I believe Desta is their president, is on the call, and for White Lutherans for Racial Justice, and that Micah, our board president for ELM, I believe, is on the call. Desta, would you be willing to just offer us a greeting and an invitation for White Lutherans for Racial Justice?
Desta had to go teach at 10, Pastor Carla. So she just slipped out.
Oh, okay.
Just did. All right. Well, Michael, then I will let you do that if you don't mind.
Great. Yeah,
What is White Lutherans for Racial Justice, and how can people be a part of it?
sure. We're one of the ELCA ethnic associations. There's the African Descent Lutheran Association, the Latino Ministries Association, and others. And in 2008, the ELCA created an organization, an association of white people who could be allies with the other associations, specifically to work on racial justice within the church and within society. And so We are continuing to be a developing and dynamic organization. Desta is one of our leaders right now. Kinna Nordstrom, Amy Appel, others on this call, Janet Divini. We have a great collection of leaders, and I'm so pleased to be their companion in this work. But if you'd like more information, check out our website, whiteluteransforracialjustice.org, and you'll find more information about us. We're also sponsoring coming up here with David Scher, who some of you know as Agape, the 5 C's. Yeah. And so that's another seminar series that we're hosting this fall, starting in October, I think that is. So find out more information there or on our Facebook page. Pastor Carla?
And Micah, would you mind unmuting for a little bit for those that are not necessarily familiar with Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries, how they can get involved as well? And just introduce yourself so folks can see you.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Pastor Micah McNett. I use pronouns like she and her. I serve on the board of directors for Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries as the co-chair. Right now, Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries supports and tries to uplift queer Lutheran leadership in North America. So we're in the ELCA and ELCIC, supporting candidates, seminarians, and rostered leaders along the journey, and trying to connect each other and continue to advocate for each other. We've gone through a bit of a tumultuous season that is growing and is hopeful in the next season of growth with the new hiring of our interim executive director, Roberto Lara. So we're really, really excited to be working with him.
So once again, you can donate to these 2 groups and the incredible work, pastoral care, studies and classes that they are creating and making possible and accessible for folks across the country. Or you can join and learn more about their programs by going to the links in the chat. And so please don't miss the rest of this series. I promise that the rest of our speakers and guests are just as exciting, dynamic, and filled with knowledge and experience as our fabulous Imran. So we will be with all of you again next Thursday. But before we leave, as we continue to hold Roberto and Bishop Curry and Secretary Mills in prayer, Michael, would you close us out and send us and bless us forth into the world of doing the work?
Yes, our pattern is that we're using the prayers from the Reverend Dr. Yolanda Denson Byers in her book. So I'll read those prayers for chapters 2 and 3 as our closing. Let us pray. Holy One, you are our refuge and safe space. We pray for the people of color in our lives who deserve to feel safe in their churches, workplaces, and communities. Forgive us for those times we stood by when our siblings were uncomfortable or under attack. Raise up actively anti-racist white folks in our church who will prophesy truth to power. Help us to diligently undertake this work, not just for our siblings of color, but also for ourselves. All-wise God, we seek your wisdom. We acknowledge that there is so much to learn about being in relationship with our BIPOC neighbors. Help us to step out of our comfort zones as we seek greater knowledge regarding the effects of racism on those we have been called to love. Help us to be honest in our white privilege and utilize it only for the good. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.